Hi everyone, it's Linda from Colorworks Designs and welcome into month number 1 of the Missouri Star Quilt Company block of the month called Starlight. I am super excited to be stitching alongside with you month by month as we create this gorgeous quilt that Carl and I designed exclusively for Jenny and the Missouri Star Quilt Company family. As with most of the blocks in this pattern, we drew our inspiration from traditional quilt patterns of years gone by. Month number 1's inspiration was a block pattern called Beginner's Delight, and I think the name couldn't be more perfect. We'll be stitching up 2 variations of this block, Block A and Block B, but we'll be making 3 blocks total, 2 of Block A and 1 of Block B. So I am super excited to get started, are you? Let's head over to the cutting board and see what we've got. If you haven't done so already, you might refer back to my Getting Started tutorial. In that tutorial, I showed you ways of setting your machine up for success, testing your 1/4 inch seam allowance, as well as tips and tricks for organizing all of your fabrics and your blocks from month to month. So let's look at what's included in month number 1's kit. You're going to get 2 2.5 inch by width of fabric, which is about 42 inches. So 2 2.5 inch width of fabric strips that are your background strips in the background color. You're also going to get an assortment of 10-inch squares. So we have this beautiful jade green square coming here, another orange like lily pad square. These are all K Fawcett fabrics. They are just gorgeous. 2 of these beautiful blue turquoisey cabbage squares, 1 pink cabbage square, and then 2 of these striped fabrics. This is a print called Jupiter, which is beautiful, and then 2 10-inch squares of the spots. And the first thing we need to do is, referring to our fabric and block color key card, is to mark each one of these fabrics with their fabric letter so we don't get mixed up when we go to cut them apart. So I'm going to use these Avery labels that I printed out in my word processing program to mark my fabrics. I like using this method because I can reuse the labels from month to month for each of the fabrics that are in the kits. So I'm going to go forth and mark, according to my fabric color key, all of the fabrics now. We'll start with fabric A. We're going to be cutting an assortment of strips and squares from these strips. Make sure that you refer to the pattern instructions. I like to read through them several times before cutting, just to make sure I get the measurements in my head before I come down to the cutting board. And we're going to start to go. I like to just make sure I'm cutting single strips here. I don't like to stack both strips together. I will leave this strip folded as I cut it so I can cut 2 increments at once according to the instructions, but I'm not going to put this particular strip with it and cut through 4 layers. I find that makes the fabric slip a little bit while you're cutting. So we're going to go forth. Also make sure that you get rid of the selvage edge before you start cutting. And of course, once you're done, you're going to want to return the fabric label to the fabric you just cut. So we're going to mark this as fabric A again and put this off to the side and continue cutting with the other 10-inch squares. As you go forth cutting the rest of the 10-inch squares that are included in month number 1's kit, make sure that you use a rotary cutter ruler such as this to measure and cut against, not your measurements on your cutting mat. The ruler is far more accurate than your cutting mat. Now we're ready to start stitching. The first step is to make half square triangles, and they couldn't be more easy. The golden rule is 2 squares in will yield 2 half square triangles out. First, let's start with our first fabric combination in the pattern, which is fabric B and C. On the wrong side of a fabric B square, we're going to draw a diagonal line with a washable marker or a Frixion iron-off pen from corner to corner. Next, we'll pair fabric B right sides together with the fabric C square and take it over to our machine. So you'll want to start with a leader piece in your machine. This is just a scrap piece of fabric about 2 inches by 2 inches. I'm just sewing right through it. What that does is it catches all your thread, it avoids thread nests, and it also helps when you pull in this corner and put that under your presser foot. It'll avoid that corner from being eaten in your feed dogs, which happens sometimes. What you're going to do is line up the edge of your presser foot on the line that you drew going down the middle of the half square triangle squares. So we'll stitch right through the leader piece piece first. I'll then lift my presser foot slightly and feed this in, and I'm lining up the edge of my 1/4 inch presser foot on the line. So I'm going to be sewing a 1/4 inch to either side of this line. Now I'll just flip it, again put my leader piece in, and come back the other way. Once done, I'm headed back to the cutting board. Next, bring it back to your cutting board and cut it apart directly on the line you drew. What that will yield for you is 2 half-square triangles with 1 fabric on either side of the square. Next, take these 2 squares over to your iron and press them in the direction that the diagram shows you in the pattern. Next, I'm ready to square up and trim my half-square triangles to the desired size in the pattern. For this particular fabric combination, I want my half-square triangles to be 2.5 by 2.5. One of the things for squaring up too that helps and trimming is it gets rid of the dog ears here at the top and also at the bottom, and those take up a lot of seam allowance if you don't get rid of them. So to make this a true 2.5 by 2.5 inch square, I'm going to use my square ruler, which has a diagonal line running from corner to corner, very similar to my half-square triangle. I'll line up the square ruler for my first cut over the diagonal line of the half-square triangle, making sure that it's running exactly parallel to the diagonal line of the half-square triangle. My first cut is simply to trim away a little bit on the right and trim away a little bit on the top. So I'll go ahead and do that. Next, I'll take these trimmings away and I'm going to rotate the block 180 degrees in order to make it a true 2.5 by 2.5. So I'll rotate 180 degrees on the cutting board. I've got a clean edge here and a clean edge here. Those were my first cut that I just made. I'll take my square ruler, I'll put it directly over the diagonal line again of the half square triangle, lining those up. But I'm also going to make sure before I trim anything away that the 2.5 inch lines of the square ruler are running straight and parallel to those clean edges I cut on the first cut. When I double check that they are, and I do one last check that the diagonal line of the square ruler is running straight and true to that diagonal line on the half square triangle, I'm ready to square it down. I'll cut on the right, I'll cut across the top, being careful that my rotary cutter doesn't slip. And once I've done that to cut, I have a perfect 2.5 by 2.5 inch square, which makes piecing the block so much easier. Once I make my first fabric combination for a half square triangle, I usually read through the next several steps of the pattern and find out what combinations I need. Then I can put the combinations together and the pairings together and chain piece them all at my machine, which makes the piecing go so much faster. As you can see from this pattern, if you read through the next several steps, you're going to need 8 BCs, 8 BGs, 4 CFs, and also 4 EF combinations. Remember, these are the half square triangles when they are complete. So you would put 4 B squares together with 4 C squares, and that would yield you the 8 BC half square triangles. Now that I've gotten all my half square triangle units trimmed and squared down, I'm ready to start stitching block A and block B together. If you notice, I've got 2 paper plates in front of me, and I mentioned this in my Getting Started tutorial, that this is the way I like to organize my block units. So I'm going to put together all the units that go together to make 2 block A's on this plate, and all the units that go together to make 1 block B on this plate. You might have a different way of organizing, like file folders or perhaps plastic bags. You do whatever works for you. But I like the paper plate method. So I'm going to start with block A, and I'm going to refer to the pattern photo in the pattern and gather those units together. I've got those fabric A strips, I've got fabric D strips, I've got half square triangles made out of fabric B and fabric C, I've got half square triangles made out of fabric B and fabric G, and I've also got some fabric G squares. Those are all the units I need to make 2 block A's. Now I'm going to go on to block B. Again, I'll refer to the pattern photo so I know what units I need, And again, I've got fabric A squares that I've cut. I've got fabric D strips. I've got fabric F strips. I've got fabric E strips. I also have half square triangles made out of fabric C and fabric F. And I have half square triangles made out of fabric E and fabric F. That's everything I need for block B. So now I'm ready to take my plates over to my sewing machine and start stitching the blocks together. We'll start with block A. So on the right-hand side, I have a completed block A unit. And on the left-hand side, I have a quarter of what the center unit is here in the block A unit. As you can see from looking at block A, the center unit, which is what we're going to start with, is simply 4 of these units that you see on the left-hand side, and each one is rotated in a different direction. So we're going to start by sewing together these 2 squares at the bottom, the BC half square triangle to the G square, and then we will top it off with the D rectangle. What we're going to do is sew those together, and we'll take a benchmark measurement when we're done with this unit to make sure we're headed in the right direction and that our block is going to finish at the desired size we need to in the pattern. Make sure that you follow all the pressing diagrams in the pattern so that your seams nest nicely together when you're done making the block. And there you go. Once I get my unit stitched together and pressed, I'll bring it back over to my cutting mat here. I'm going to do a benchmark measurement just to make sure I'm headed in the right direction before I finish piecing the entire block. So I know from my pattern the benchmark measurement for this unit should be 4.5 by 4.5. And when I put my square ruler on there, it looks like I'm good to go. It is 4.5 by 4.5. So now I'm ready to sew the other 3 units that look exactly like this. Because like I said, these are just simply rotated over around the block to make the center unit of block A. So guess what? I'm going to grab my paper plate. That's what I'm going to take over to my sewing machine. I'm going to load up 3 more Ds, 3 more BC half square triangles, and 3 more G squares, and I'm ready to start piecing these all together. I can chain piece now because I know how the unit goes together. And so there you go. I've got all 4 quadrants sewn and pressed and ready to go to start completing block A. Once I get these done, I'll bring them back over to my cutting board and do a cursory measurement on each one, just like before, making sure that it measures the benchmark measurement indicated in the pattern of 4.5 by 4.5. If for some reason it doesn't, this gives me an opportunity to check my 1/4 inch seam to see if I need to be a little more scant, or perhaps to look at the pressing that I did on the back, or even if I got it a little bit larger, then it gives me an opportunity to trim the block down to the benchmark measurement size. But I know that all of mine are 4.5, so I'm going to go ahead and start laying them out for the center of block A. And this is just a rotation of this quadrant by 90 degrees, or you can follow the diagram there in the pattern. Once I have these 4 quadrants laid out on my cutting board in the correct formation, it's just a matter of sewing them together. I'll sew the 2 halves together at the top, and if I needed to, I'll pin at this seam to make sure that my seams nest nicely together, and then I'll sew the 2 bottom halves together, and then top and bottom half go together to complete the center unit. Once I get all 4 quadrants sewn together and pressed, I'm going to give it another measurement, again following the pattern for what the benchmark measurement should be at this point, and it's 8.5 by 8.5. And I can see here that my blocks are measuring 8.5 by 8.5. I'm now ready to start putting on the fabric A strips to either side. And so this is just simply sewing this strip to the left-hand side and another strip to the right-hand side at this point. Now that my left and right hand strips are sewn on to the center unit of block A, I'm almost ready to complete it. All I need to do is sew these half square triangles onto either side of fabric A strips for the top and the bottom. Take note of which way these blocks are orientated and be sure to refer back to the pattern diagram in your pattern. And there you go. There is my completed first block A, and it measures 12.5 by 12.5. I know that because that's what the pattern is telling me it should measure. Now I just go back and I repeat the process, and I make a second block A. Once those 2 blocks are done, I'm ready to move on to block B. So here's block B, and isn't it gorgeous? It's beautiful in these cave faucet fabrics. Block B is simply a variation on block A. We're going to start in a very similar fashion by sewing together the quadrant that goes in together in the middle that creates this pinwheel. And so you can see I have off to the left the units that comprise that. We've got a CF half square triangle, an A square, and then a D strip on top. So we're simply going to sew the A square to the CF triangle, half square triangle first, and then cap it off with the D rectangle, and then take a benchmark measurement to make sure we're headed in the right direction. Now that we've completed this little unit here, we give it the cursory measurement. Again, you'll find that in the pattern, but I know it's supposed to be 4.5 by 4.5. And again, if you want to give it a little trim or correct your seam allowance, now's the time to do it. And then before we make more of these, this is a little different than block A, where block B differs just slightly from block A. We're going to actually add the F strip onto the side here, and we're also going to sew an EF half square triangle to an E strip at the top and connect that to this as well, which will make the top quadrant here, this block here. Once we do 4 of those, we just simply rotate them around the unit and our block B is complete. And there you go, I've got 1/4 of block B completed. And again, I'll want to make a cursory measurement here just to make sure I'm headed in the right direction. It should measure 6.5 by 6.5, and it does. And if it does, then I'm ready to go ahead and construct 3 more of these units. And as you can see, once I get 4 units complete, this is just simply rotated around in a 90-degree fashion, just like block A, to complete one block B, which would then measure 12.5 by 12.5 when you're complete. And remember those paper plates we started with? Well, I like to cut these letters out now, and I'll pin them to my finished blocks so that after the 8 months are complete, I've got all my blocks labeled when I go to put the entire quilt top together. So thank you so much for joining us for month 1, and I can't wait to see all of you for month 2, where we'll be making a new block pattern, but in 2 different sizes. Happy coloricious quilting, everybody!